There are a few species out there that are not really related to any great extent to the main crop species. I suppose the one that springs to mind is Phacelia. It's not really related to any of the main crop species. You'd have maybe more exotic things like linseed and sunflower as well they could be an option. If you're not going directly in front of a legume crop, you can include things like vetches in there as well. So something like Phacelia and vetch, which is a fairly common mix out there, is probably as safe as it gets.
All farmers strive to improve soils over time, but farmers have to cope with years like 2023 into 2024, where relentless rain led to poor soil conditions, forcing farmers to work in soils which may have led to damage. The time between the main crops can be a good time to address soil issues which may have arisen, and cover crops may have a part to play in the repair process. You are listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow, and give us a review on Apple or Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast from. Cover crops are championed universally as they can perform many functions for the soil, such as preventing nutrient loss or carbon capture and improving soil health. I am delighted to be joined today by Dr. Richie Hackett, a researcher in Teagasc and Oak Park, who has completed extensive research work with cover crops over the years. Richie, just first want to ask you, what exactly is a cover crop?
Well, I suppose in simple terms, a cover crop is a crop that you grow during a fallow period between two crops, and typically they're grown before spring crops, so where the land would normally be left idle over the winter period, but they can be grown before winter crop as well, for example, between two winter barley crops. But so that's essentially what it is. There's various different names used. Some people use the word catch crop. Some people use the word green manure. Some people use fodder or forage crops. I would consider those slightly different in that they're grown specifically to produce a fodder for livestock, whereas a cover crop is usually grown just to cover the soil or to catch nutrients without having a direct beneficial or economic effect, even though they can be grazed at times. In terms of what do you grow as a cover crop, you ask, can it be one species, two species, or lots of species? It can be whatever you want it to be. It's just a plant that's there just to cover the soil for whatever objective you want to achieve with it. So yes, it can be just a single species, and many people do grow single species, although more commonly people are growing two or more species, particularly if you're in one of the schemes where the cover crop is a part of the scheme, such as the likes of Gloss in the past and acres.
And you mentioned, Richie, you can perform many different roles, or I suppose, I think your words were, it depends what you want it to be. What sort of roles can a cover crop perform for farmers?
There's various different roles. I would suggest that in the current climate, where there's a lot of worry about nitrate levels in rivers, and that's causing a lot of concern with the environmental side of the house, that one of the main functions is to reduce the loss of nitrate and other nutrients to water bodies, and that's a key reason why people should consider growing cover crops. But as well as that, there's a lot of other functions that are more of a direct benefit to the farmer in terms of potential benefits on, soil characteristics, be they soil physical characteristics such as compaction, or biological characteristics such as the activity of the microbes in the soil, and various things like that. So I suppose what's more commonly referred to these days as soil health, that cover crops can have beneficial effects on soil health. So there is a range of roles that they can play for the farmer. I suppose the key thing that I would suggest is that you really need to know what you want to get out of your cover crop before you actually go to decide on what cover crop you're going to grow and when you're going to sow it, and that sort of thing. It's knowing exactly what you want to get out of it.
And with that in mind, you mentioned that cover crops can capture some of those nutrients that's there. In terms of the nutrients that are captured by those plants, are any of those recycled back into the next crop?
Yes, they will be recycled. I suppose the tricky part is knowing what proportion of them will be recycled into the next crop, particularly in terms of nitrogen. So these cover crops can accumulate considerable amounts of nitrogen, so we can get 80, 90 kilos per hectare with a very good cover crop into the cover crop material. And if you're ploughing that back in, the question is how much of that is released to the next crop, and that's not an easy question to answer. It could be 0% of it, or it could be 30, 40% of it. It really depends on the type of material that you're recovering back in to the soil. But yes, some of them will be recycled back into the crop, but predicting the amount that will be recycled is quite difficult. I suppose in terms of the other nutrients, the likes of potassium and phosphorus and sulfur, they will all be returned to the soil as well, and will become available at various levels of speed, if you like. So some will be recovered in the next crop, some will be there for the following crop again. So it's predicting the availability of the nutrients is the difficult part, but definitely some of them will be recycled back into the next crop.
Okay. And I suppose with that in mind, in terms of growing the best cover crop you can, if you're going to spend money on it, what is the best time to plant that crop?
Well, I suppose the answer to that is simple in one sense, is that earlier is better. So as soon as you have the previous crop removed from the field, get in as quickly as you can with your cover crop. So ideally, if you're talking after winter barley, you'd be talking late July or early August. If you're talking, say, spring barley, in a normal year, you'd be looking at sort of mid to late August, and getting the straw off as quickly as you can, and getting in with your cover crop as soon as possible will give you the best chance of getting good establishment, good growth, and maximizing the benefits of the cover crop on the next crop. Is the more of a cover crop that's there, the more positive effect it's going to have on the succeeding crop as well.
You had, Richie, some very nice data coming, I think it was last year or the year before, in terms of that date of sowing versus the amount of dry matter coming out of it. You might just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we did some work looking at essentially 3 different sowing dates. So sort of late July, very late July, last days of July, sort of around about the middle of August, which would sort of correspond to, say, a normal spring barley harvest date, and then sort of into early September, which is sort of if you get delayed, when you'll end up sowing it. And we basically showed that the amount of biomass produced by the cover crop decreased almost in a straight line, where for every 2 to 3 weeks we're losing about 2 tons per hectare of dry matter production from the cover crop. So once you went into September, the amount of growth that you got was very, very small, even from a fast growing species, a relatively fast growing species such as mustard. So it really demonstrated the importance of sowing as early as possible to get the best growth of the crop.
Okay. And I suppose with that in mind, it's not a normal year this year. The majority of our spring barley is probably not going to be harvested until probably very late August or maybe even early September. With that in mind, is it a bit too late to sow cover crops after that date?
It's certainly getting on the late side, but I suppose something is better than nothing. So if you've just bare soil, well then whatever is there is going to be lost, and you're getting no positive effect on the next crop. I suppose what I would suggest is, well, it becomes even more and more important to get in as quickly as you can after the harvest, and not let it go into mid to late September when you get around to sowing your crop. But you also probably need to think about what you're going to grow, and perhaps avoid some of the more expensive mixes that may not come to a whole pile, and maybe try just stick with some of the cheaper mixes to try and reduce your cost, and reduce the risk of not getting a whole pile of benefit.
And there are, I suppose, plenty of different mixtures out there. As you mentioned earlier, around acres and that, you need at least 2, but there's certainly mixtures out there with up to kind of 7 or 10 different things in it. Should a farmer be concerned about adding all these different types of species in terms of, spreading or maybe multiplying disease within the soils or maybe into the next crop?
It depends on your rotation to an extent. If you have a good rotation with 4 or 5 crops in there already, with the likes of beans and oilseed rape and oats in there, it becomes quite difficult to pick species that don't have some potential negative impact on one of those crops. So it's difficult to pick a lot of species. When you're putting in a mix with a lot of species in there, one or two of them is likely to have some potential negative effect. Obviously, if it's in there at a very low proportion, the negative effect is going to be significantly reduced compared to if you grew that crop in as a pure cover crop, just a single species cover crop. So it's not easy to pick a species. Certainly, if I was sown in early September, mid-September, I think I'd keep it simple and one or two species and because you're probably not going to get the benefit of the multiple species sowing that late in the season because they're just not going to grow to a huge amount at that stage.
Unmerited, okay. And as you rightly said, that those mixtures become quite expensive, I suppose, at the time. Just thinking, Richie, about the different species that's there. Are there any of those species that are, potentially antagonistic to the next crop?
Yes, I suppose the direct antagonism, the one that we've seen most often and has been reported abroad as well, is something like rye. It's probably not used, forage rye, it's probably not used very extensively in cover crop mixes, but we have seen negative effects on the establishment of the next spring barley crop where we've had a single species forage rye crop as a cover crop before it, and that has been reported abroad. Some people have suggested that where there's a lot of oats in the mix, or maybe even a pure cover crop of oats and a lot of it, and you plough that down or you incorporate it in a min-till system before sowing a spring barley crop, that it can affect establishment. I've never seen that in our work, but there is reports of it. There are other types of interactions as well, where we mentioned disease effect, carryover effects. Obviously, one that's becoming more prominent in recent years is clubroot in brassicas, particularly oilseed rape, and that is something that can be multiplied up by continuous growing of brassica cover crops, and that's something that people that have oilseed rape in their rotation should be conscious of as well, and that will it's not I suppose an antagonistic effect. It's a disease effect, but it's a big problem when it does occur in your field.
And I suppose farmers listening to this will probably be thinking, Jesus, is there anything particularly safe or relatively safe if I have a diverse rotation, as you mentioned earlier, with oilseed rape maybe and beans in it? If somebody's put you to the pin of your collar and asked you, well, what's the one I should really go for? That's going to be safe and give me some benefits, but not necessarily make any disease problems anywhere worse. What would you go for?
A difficult question. There are a few species out there that are not really related to any great extent to the main crop species. I suppose the one that springs to mind is Phacelia. It's not really related to any of the main crop species. You'd have maybe more exotic things like linseed and sunflower as well that are, they could be an option. Where there isn't a lot, if you're not going directly in front of a legume crop, you can include things like vetches in there as well. I'd be inclined to avoid vetches in a mix if I was directly in front of, say, a bean crop. But at other points in the rotation, I'd be less worried. So something like Phacelia and vetch, which is a fairly common mix out there, is probably as safe as it gets. If you're in a more simple rotation, maybe you're somebody that just grows malting barley, spring malting barley, then you have obviously lots of options because as long as you steer clear of something like the rye that I mentioned, you have lots more options that are possible without causing a negative effect on your rotation.
Okay, very good. And I suppose, Richie, where maybe a lot of the companies are coming from, a lot of talk about sustainability, an awful lot more talk about carbon capture and reducing greenhouse gas effects and that kind of stuff. How good or what role can cover crops play in terms of carbon capture?
Yeah, well, cover crops can put quite a bit of carbon into the soil. How much they put in comes back to the question of growth. The more growth, the more biomass you produce, the more carbon you're putting in there. So if you think of cover crop biomass, dry matter is probably 40 something, somewhere in the low 40% carbon. If you know how much biomass you're producing, you can get a rough idea of how much carbon you're actually putting into the soil. So, for example, if you're putting in, if you're growing a 3 ton per hectare of dry matter in a cover crop, and let's say it's 40% carbon, then you're putting in about 1.2 tons of carbon into your soil when you incorporate that cover crop back into your soil. So you can get an idea of how much you're putting in, but I suppose the next question would be how much of that actually stays in the soil, and that's not what you put in isn't what stays in the soil. So if you put in 1.2 tons of carbon in a year, not all of that carbon stays in there. Once the bugs and the microbes in the soil start breaking down that, they're essentially start releasing a large chunk of that carbon as carbon dioxide that eventually ends up back in the atmosphere. And in terms of how much of it, the carbon that you put in is actually retained, varies, but sort of figures, maybe around 20% of it is retained, is what some of the research would suggest. It can be higher or lower than that, depending on the actual material that you put in. But ballpark, maybe that's what you might be putting in. So if you take 20% of our 1.2 tons of carbon, that's about, I think, 240 kilos of carbon per hectare that you would be putting in. And that 3 ton of dry matter that we spoke about is a pretty good crop of a cover crop. You'd be looking at sowing sometime in mid-August to try and get that amount of biomass grown.
Is there any way that a farmer can maximize that carbon capture, or maybe a different way of putting it, to minimize the loss, I suppose, in terms of the carbon that was captured by the cover crop?
That's not an easy question. I suppose how much of it is retained depends on the material that you put in. It comes down to, it's a little bit technical, but it comes down to the ratio of carbon and nitrogen in the material. The more carbon you have relative to nitrogen, the more of the carbon that will stay in the soil. And basically what that boils down to is how stemmy the material is. So if you let the material go more mature, that will tend to increase the amount of carbon that's retained in the soil. It is linked to the sort of the chemical characteristics of the material that you're incorporating into the soil.
A final tricky question, because it sounds like I'm after asking a lot of tricky questions already, Richie, but a final tricky question, this might be tricky enough as well. Farmers often have a question around, we talked about disease carryover. Well, what about the volunteers? Are they going to carry over different diseases and maybe harbour pests, the likes of aphids? And should the farmer try and get rid of those from the cover crop?
Yeah, that is a tricky question. I suppose my answer to that would be, first of all, I would be trying to get my cover crop established as early as possible, so it's more vigorous and it will tend to outcompete those volunteers to an extent. In terms of whether you should try get rid of them, technically, as far as I'm aware, none of the graminicides are approved for use on cover crops, so you shouldn't probably be using them on cover crops. But the other reason I wouldn't be using them is we know there's lots of issues with build-up of resistance, grass weed resistance to herbicides, and including these graminicides as another round of these graminicides is only going to increase the risk of that occurring. I think my answer to that would be, if you're worried about the volunteers, I would be looking at destroying the cover crop a bit earlier in the spring. Spraying it off in January sometime, and giving a good long period between when you burn off the crop and you sow the next crop to help reduce the risk of all those carryover problems.
Richie, as always, you're a mind of very good practical information. Thanks very much for joining us today, and look, we'll catch up with you again shortly. Thanks, Richie.
Thank you, Michael.
So that's it for this week, and my thanks to Richie for joining me on the show. You might also be interested in attending a blight workshop here in Oak Park on Thursday, August the 29th from 2 to 4 p.m. At the workshop, we'll be looking at the blight control strategies employed here in Oak Park, and also giving you an update on some of the various blight strains which are very worrying across the industry at the moment. So finally, that's it for this week. And if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.